A guy was involved in a fatal crash on this road. With police help, we set up a reconstruction that I'm going to try and follow. He should have taken his foot off the pedal here. The suspension's lightened and he could have lost it. The camber here pushed him away from the corner. He's lucky there was no one coming the other way. Whoa, pay attention. The conditions nearly caught him out there. Whoa, I wouldn't even try that. The guy had no chance going at that speed.
Even the best drivers in the world adjust their speed on country roads.
So they get David Coulthard, former Formula One driver, and David Coulthard jumps in a car, kind of follows the ghost car as it goes down this country road. And the point of Coulthard's commentary is to show where boundaries have been exceeded, limits have been tested, even where kind of rules have been broken, and ultimately where a fatality has happened. And Coulthard focuses your eyes on the fatality and says, you need to learn this lesson, all right? Cocky young drivers need to see that driving like this on a country road could kill you. That's the point. Now, 1 Corinthians 10 is Paul doing something similar. He doesn't jump in a car, but he might as well not following someone down a country road in a car, but he's following God's people Israel through their history. And in these verses that we're going to read, verses 1 to 13, he's going to show where boundaries are crossed, where limits are tested, where laws are broken. And ultimately, he's going to show us where fatalities have happened so that, like this video, we would learn their lessons. At the end of the video, David Coulthard kind of sat there, the car's on its roof, the wheels are spinning, and he forces you to look at it. Paul focuses in even more of a kind of brutal image. We're going to get to the end of verse 5 where he says there are just bodies scattered in the wilderness. So read with me verse 1, and we'll read to verse 5. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1. For I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that was the same spirit, the rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. So he starts off by saying, let me list all the good things that the one true God has done for his people. And he talks about God's presence with them. God has been forever with them, never left them, never forsaken them. And the story goes that he was with them in this cloud. They all knew the presence of God. More than that, they all knew the power of God. He tells the story very briefly of how God brought them through the Red Sea when they were escaping from Egypt. They had the presence of God in the cloud. They'd seen the power of God bringing them through the sea. But they'd also had the provision of God. The only reason they were still alive today was because in that journey from Egypt to their current place, God had given them food and drink every single day. The presence, the power, the provision of God. However, although the one true God had been unbelievably faithful to them, they had repaid his faithfulness with unfaithfulness. Most of them responded by rebelling. And so all of those who had experienced his presence, power, and provision, those that responded to that with unfaithfulness did not please God, and so were punished by him. Which is why Paul makes an example of these Israelites for the sake of us as readers, just as David Coulthard makes an example of that driver for us as drivers. He says that twice. Look at verse 6. Now these things occurred as what? What's the word? Examples. To keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Look down to verse 11. These things happened to them as what? Examples, and were written down as warnings for us on whom the culmination of the ages has come. Just like Coulthard is using this as a warning, as an example, Paul says twice in 1 Corinthians 10, these things are examples to us. Now, if you've been with us in church the last few weeks, you'll know that Paul has been addressing an issue in the church in Corinth where there's been people in the church who are asserting their right in Corinth to eat meat that has been sacrificed in an idol temple. That's what he's been speaking to. And the people who are asserting their right to go into another religion's temple and eat food sacrificed to their gods, their argument has gone like this, and you may remember it. They said, listen, God is God. Idols are nothing. Therefore, food is just food. So their conclusion was, anyone remember? Nom, 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 nom. All right? You might as well tuck in. God is God, idols are nothing, food's just food, so nom, 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 nom. Now, Paul has said, no, wait. There are some new Christians in your church, we'll call them those who are weaker in their conscience. And for them, although now they believe there is only one true God, for them idols were not nothing, but everything. And so for them, food isn't just food, but food had baggage. And so their conscience wouldn't let them say, nom, 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 nom. Their conscience said, no, 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 no. Do you remember that? Now, Paul has said to them, listen, if you going nom, nom, nom with idol food causes a weaker brother to be destroyed, guess what you should do? You should relinquish your rights, forsake your freedom, and instead not eat meat for the sake of your brother or sister in Christ. That's what Kenny showed us last week. You follow Paul's example. You give it up. This week he's going to go a little bit further. He's going to raise the stakes a little bit higher and say, listen, this may not just destroy your weaker brother or sister in church. This could destroy you. A tagline for 1 Corinthians 10 could be, idolatry kills. Me and Ian were sat in Captain's Cafe Wednesday morning, in fact, outside in the sun. It was sunny one day this week. We're sat outside in the cafe, and I glanced down and I saw Ian's fag packet, right? And one of those things that you notice on a fag packet, I've forgotten, you see it again, is a brutal image, isn't it? The one on Ian's one on Wednesday was a father lying in an open casket with a mother holding a young daughter in her arms. Now, what's the point of that image? It tells you on the fag packet, smoking kills. It's a brutal image. But today, Paul focuses on an image, not an open casket and a mum and daughter, but bodies scattered in the wilderness, and he says, not smoking kills, idolatry kills. He's raising the stakes. Last week, Kenny reminded us from 1 Corinthians 9. He says, let me take an imaginary image. Let's take a race. The Christian life's like a race. And you need to run well. You need to run obediently. You need to run to win the prize. It's like a kind of imaginary situation. Let's compare it to a race. Today he's saying, listen, I'm not imagining anymore. This is real life. This is your history. This is your forefathers. It killed them. Idolatry kills. And so what we're going to do this morning is, in between those two things, verse 6, these happen as examples. Verse 11, these happen as examples. Come 4 lessons from their forefathers. And that's what we're going to look at. 4 lessons from their forefathers. Look at verse 7. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. So he's speaking again, right, of God's people who had experienced all those 3 things we talked about at the start. Remember the 3 P's? They'd experienced the presence of God, the power of God, the provision of God. All of them. And the story behind verse 7 is this whole story of the Exodus from Egypt. So the story goes, they are enslaved to Egypt, brutal slavery. And yet God remarkably brings them out of Egypt. You know the story of the 10 plagues? Brings them out of Egypt through the Red Sea, and he brings them at the bottom of a mountain called Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, Moses goes up to the top, the people go at the bottom, and what does Moses receive on the top of the mountain? The 10 Commandments. Commandment number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. Now that just makes sense when they've come out of Egypt, because what has God just done? He's destroyed, decimated, and defeated every single idol in Egypt. They're nothing. You shall have no other gods before me. Commandment number 2. And don't make any images. Don't make any images, idols, and bow down to them and worship them. So that's Moses on top of the mountain. He comes down, and guess what God's people are doing at the bottom? They've taken all their jewelry, all their gold, and they've melted it down, and they've made a cow. A golden cow. And do you know what they're saying? This cow is the God that brought us out of Egypt. What do you think Moses is saying? Nah, it's a cow. What are you doing? It's a gold cow. It can't have brought you out of Egypt because you've just made it. And yet we're told in Exodus 32, so the next day the people rose and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings to the cow. And afterwards they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Now notice that. They don't just worship the cow. What do they do afterwards? They ate and they drank. What's Paul talking about in 1 Corinthians 10? Eating in an idol temple. As in 1 Corinthians 10, so in Exodus 32, you cannot worship an idol and eat in its presence. That is out of order for God's people. The Corinthians wanted to separate those things and say, I can eat in the presence of an idol. That doesn't mean I'm worshiping it. Whereas Paul and Moses say, nah, those things go together. And so God is not pleased. And although the punishment is not spoken of in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Exodus is clear that because of that act of idolatry, 3,000 people are killed by a sword and thousands more are killed by a plague. Idolatry kills. God will punish idolaters. Now, I'm almost 100% certain that none of us have ever melted down our gold, made a cow, and bowed down before it. If you have, right, each your own, but I'm guessing not many of us have. And yet idols are an issue for all of us. An idol is not just a physical thing that you bow down to. In the language of verse 6, an idol is anything that you set your heart on. For some of us, it's respect. For others, it might be escape. For some, it's success. Others, fame. Some career. Others, sex. For some, family. For others, comfort. For some, pleasure. Let me ask you some questions to help you discover where your idolatry is, what your idols are. Question number 1. What does your heart get fixated on when you lie down in bed at night, turn the light off, and you're just left with your own thoughts? Because whatever your heart gets fixed on is probably your idol. Question 2. When your heart feels like it can't cope, when life gets hard, what does your heart run to? That's probably your idol. Another question. When you get angry with people, what does your heart tell you that you deserve? That's probably your idol. One last question. What does your heart tell you is right, even when you know that what it's telling you is right is actually wrong? Basically, the question is, what does your heart lie to you about and say, it's okay? That's probably your idol. See, we may not have replaced God with a golden cow, but we've all replaced God. And we may not all have burnt sacrifices to an idol, but we've all given to something or someone something that was only deserved to God. And that may be a someone, it may be a something, it may be a substance, it may be yourself. But we need verse 7 to say to us, do not be idolaters, because that is exactly what we are. Now let me ask you a question. These people committed idolatry, they worshipped something that wasn't God, and they were punished by God for it, they died. Here's my question. Has God suddenly become more tolerant of idolatry or more lax in punishing idolaters? We'll come back to that. 2, let's read verse 8. From idolatry to sexual immorality. Verse 8, we should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. Again, here's the story, right? All of God's people had experienced those 3 Ps: the presence of God, the power of God, the provision of God. All of them. And the story behind this is Numbers 25. Here's what happens in Numbers 25. The Israelite nation meet the Moabite nation. The Israelite men cop a view of the Moabite girls. And basically, Love Island happens. I'm going to read Numbers 25. While Israel was staying in Shittim, you have to be careful how you say that name, the man began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite woman, who invited them to sacrifice to their gods. Notice what they do next. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before their gods. So Israel yoked themselves to Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. Now notice what goes together. Not just immorality in terms of sexual stuff with the Moabite woman, but when they indulged in immorality, it led to idolatry. And as they engaged in idolatry, what did they then do? They ate and drank with the Moabite people. See, as in 1 Corinthians 10, as in Exodus 32, so too in Numbers 25, worshipping an idol is linked to eating in the presence of that idol. The two go together. And God isn't pleased. And how many people are we told died on that day? 23,000. You could fill Tynecastle Stadium with the dead bodies, and there would still be 3,000 bodies that didn't have a seat. Bodies scattered everywhere. Now again, I'm willing to bet that nobody in this church has ever spied a Moabite woman, slept with her, and then engaged in idolatry to the Moabite god, right? It's not us. However, if sexual morality is defined by God, as we've seen in 1 Corinthians, if sex is given by God as a gift to one man and one woman who are united in a lifelong, forever relationship of marriage, and anything outside of that God deems as immorality, then we all fall short. Our past is full of sexual immorality. Our present spiritual battles are often about sexual immorality, and our hearts are full of lust. See, we need verse 8 to say to us, we should not commit sexual immorality because we do. Now let me ask you that same question again. These people engaged in it, 23,000 die. Has God suddenly become more tolerant of sexual immorality or lax in punishing the sexually immoral? We'll come back to that question. Number 3, look at verse 9. We should not test Christ as some of them did and were killed by snakes. Now again, all of these people experienced the presence, the power, the provision of God. He'd been so good to them. And the story behind this verse is Numbers chapter 21. Listen to what happens. God's people traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food." What are they complaining about? God, particularly what he has given them in terms of food. Same as 1 Corinthians, same as Exodus, same as Numbers. But here the issue is not so much food that's been sacrificed to an idol, but food in relationship to God. And they make their appetite in their stomach the test of God's faithfulness to them. And God had already done more than they deserved. He rescued them from Egypt. He'd given them everything they needed. He'd given them food and water so that they were alive today. But they reduced God from being this kind of powerful provider God that they should thank to being like a waiter in a restaurant that they can complain to. Now, this isn't so much about making food that's been sacrificed to a so-called God. It's making themselves God over the issue of food. The Israelites don the position of like Paul Hollywood. Anyone watch that Bake Off program? They become Paul Hollywood, and guess who God is? He's this little contestant at a little booth that they're saying, "Nah, I'm not having it." They put God on trial. They make themselves gods, and they say, okay, let's see if God passes the test. And again, God is not pleased, and the punishment justly comes. Many Israelites die. Now again, the chances are not many of us are going to make the test of God's faithfulness what is in our cupboards. Maybe sometimes we might. But the chances are that when it comes that we are kind of dissatisfied with what God has given us, like unhappy with the circumstances that seem to be kind of dominating our lives, or maybe just dissatisfied with God's timing, we can put God on trial. And we may not say, okay, God, my faithfulness to you is dependent on whether you give me this food. But we might say, okay, God, my faithfulness to you is dependent on whether or not you give me that job. Or whether or not you provide that partner. Or whether or not you give me that house. Or whether or not you give me my health back. And we put God on trial and we ask him, okay, let's see if you pass the test. See, we need verse 9 to say to us, we should not test the Lord, because we do, don't we? Now let me ask the question again. Has God suddenly become more tolerant of those who test him, or more lax in punishing testers? Fourth thing, verse 10. From idolaters to sexually immoral, to testers, to grumblers. Look at verse 10. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. Now, same gig goes, right? All of them experienced the presence, the power, and the provision of God. And the story behind verse 10 is probably Numbers chapter 14. Let me read this to you. Again, see the common thread. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we died in Egypt or in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to fall by the sword? Our wives and our children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Now, how mental is that? What are they picturing Egypt as? It's as if they're chatting to each other going, do you mind Egypt? What would you give it on TripAdvisor? Maybe a 5, right? It's quite nice, Egypt. Remember I had that nice sea? I used to love the Red Sea. It was nice, wasn't it? And they've got this kind of rose-tinted view of Egypt. But what was Egypt for them? Slavery. There was no hope in Egypt. There was only oppression and death in Egypt. And God, who had brought them out of it and had promised an unbelievable future, having rescued them from an unbelievably bad past, what are they now saying? Let's go back to Egypt. They grumble in the present because they forgot how bad the past was, and they forget how good the future will be. And they grumble against God. Their present circumstances cloud everything God has done and everything God has promised, and they say, enough's enough, let's go back to Egypt. And so we're told that many were killed by the destroying angel. Now, if you know the story of the Exodus, do you remember the role that the destroying angel had? It was actually the destroying angel that saved them from Egypt. It was part of what God used to convince Pharaoh to let his people go. And yet the mental agonizing irony here is the same angel that delivered God's people from Egypt is the same angel that destroys God's people when they grumble about wanting to go back to Egypt. Now, when it comes to grumbling, it's not so hard for us to imagine, is it? Flip me, that's the Scottish nation. It's our native tongue. God has rescued us from slavery to sin. He's rescued Christians for an eternity with him, but we get obsessed with the now, and so we grumble. And here's the thought process. Maybe I should go back to life before I was a Christian. It was easier. It was better. And we get the same kind of rose-tinted view of what life was like, and we grumble. And so we need verse 10 to say to us, do not grumble, because we do. And so let me ask that question one more time. Has God suddenly become more tolerant with grumblers or more lax in punishing those who grumble? Now, what is the answer to all those 4 questions that we've asked? Has God become more tolerant? Is he more lax? The answer is no. We may not see instant punishment as they did in these 4 stories, but that does not mean that God is any displeased. Look at verse 11 again. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. Now, that word culmination just means the climax, the fulfillment, the end. God's people then lived in the time of promise. We live in the time of fulfillment. We live in the time where God has put the end in motion. We're at the end of days. And as we live in the end days, the last days, that is a reminder that there will be a last day. And so although we may not see immediate punishment, that does not mean that punishment is not coming. We live in the days of fulfillment, which means there is a day coming when everything will be fulfilled. And that means that there will be justice for every act of injustice. And that includes idolatry, sexual immorality, testing, and grumbling. These things happened as warnings for us. So Paul gives us 3 things. The first thing is this: be warned. We've experienced God's presence. He's with us by His Spirit. We've experienced God's power. He's rescued us from sin. We've experienced God's provision. He's with us and brought us to this very day. But hear this, be warned. None of those things are an excuse to revel in sin. Idolatry is not nothing. Idolatry is an assault on the one true God. And sexual immorality is not nothing. It is adultery in God's presence. And testing is not nothing. It is anarchy against God's power. And testing and grumbling is not nothing. It is mutiny against God's provision. We live in the last days. And so you're reveling in every single one of these things will be a charge against you or a charge against me on that final day. And just because we don't see any immediate evidence of God's displeasure does not mean that there will not be eventual punishment. I think some of us just I do this. We think, okay, if I got away with that yesterday, then I might as well do it again today. But living the same way a second day and seemingly getting away with it is no evidence that God is turning a blind eye. Paul warns us, do not relax into patterns of sinful behavior. You need to be warned. As well as saying be warned, he says, listen, be careful. Look at verse 12. So, if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to man. Now, I think I'd always read that verse in a way that kind of made me feel better about things. Listen, your temptations, what you face, they're common to everyone. And that kind of made me feel, phew, I'm not alone. We're all in this together. But actually, I think that commonality in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, is not meant to make you relax, but it actually heightens the warning. What is common in 1 Corinthians 10? What is common is the temptation that their forefathers had. What was common for their forefathers was what destroyed their forefathers. Which means if it destroyed them, it could destroy me. That's why Paul says, be careful. If you think you're standing firm, listen, supposed strength in yourself is suicidal. You cannot do this on your own. Overestimating yourself in temptation is deadly, and underestimating temptation is deadly. Paul says, be careful. See these 4 things: idolatry, sexual immorality, grumbling, and testing. None of these are neutral ground. If you're playing with these things, you are on enemy territory. And if they destroyed your forefathers, they could destroy you. But the third application is the sweet one. Look at verse 13, halfway through. Finally, some good news. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Now, in 1 Corinthians 10, God's faithfulness swings in both directions. God is just as faithful to His stern warnings as He is to His gracious promises. The destroying angel can save God's people or destroy God's people. But God is faithful. Now, why is that good news? Well, if you're anything like me, you look at those 4 things in their history and you think, those 4 things are so me. That is my story. I am an idolater. I am sexually immoral. I have tested God. I grumble against God. And we need to own that. And so what hope is there for us? What is to stop me from being one of these bodies in the wilderness? What's to stop me from being an example to other people like the video? Our hope is in the faithfulness of God. What does God provide in verse 13? What is God faithful to provide? A way out. That's Exodus language, isn't it? A way out. The significant moment in Israelite history, the way out, the exodus from Egypt to safety, is applied to your story. Where I was a slave to my sin, God brought a new exodus. He brought me out. Where I had fallen, Jesus stood. And where I deserved to be a body in the wilderness, Jesus' body descended into the grave. And where I deserved never to rise again, Jesus' body rose from the grave. Which means what for me? There's a way out. It may feel today like there is no way out, but that is exactly how the Israelites felt in Egypt. But in these verses it says there is a way out of slavery to freedom, a way out from falling to standing firm. And your hope is not in yourself, it is in the faithfulness of God. But what's significant about this verse in 1 Corinthians 10 is that he just doesn't apply it once to when you became a Christian. He applies it to every single moment that you face temptation as a Christian. The significant moment in Israel's history, the Exodus, is applied to every single moment that you are tempted to rebel against God. I mean, think of it this way. It is just as much of a battle for you to get out of a moment of temptation as it was for God to get the Israelites out of Egypt. But every day, in every temptation, we are promised God provides an exodus. He provides a way out. So that when you are tempted to idolatry or sexual immorality or testing or grumbling, God will part the Red Sea somewhere for you to walk out. Some of us may be at the point where it feels like there is no way out. It is impossible to say no to temptation. But look just briefly back to verse 5. In verse 5, although verses 1 to 4 were dominated by they all received, they all saw, they all were saved, what does verse 5 say? It doesn't say all of them God was displeased with. What does it say? God was not pleased with most. Which means what? Although most fell, some stood. And although most were unfaithful, some were faithful. See, there was a way to endure temptation. There is a way to escape temptation. There is an exodus out of temptation, but it is not in your strength. It is in the faithfulness of God. Now, most people read a fag packet that says smoking kills, and what do they do anyway? They smoke the fags. And most people watch a video like that about driving on a country road, and what do they still do? They drive like an idiot. Most of us will read 1 Corinthians 10, and it will have no effect. It is meant to bring change. You are meant to learn the lesson. He is offering you a way out. You need to take it. His faithfulness will lead to life, but idolatry will kill. Listen, don't read the fag packet and keep smoking. Don't watch the video and keep driving like an idiot. Don't read 1 Corinthians 10 and keep running from God. He's offering you a way out. He wants you to change. His faithfulness is where you need to live your life.